Okay, hi everyone. Well, I think it's 4 o'clock, and what does that mean? It's time to drink some wine. So my name's Tom Davies, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our first virtual barrel tasting party of 2022. Welcome everyone. It's so great to have so many of you joining us, and I want to give a warm welcome to my esteemed group of co-hosts today.
All right, hold on. There's.
I'm pretty sure that's true.
Good to see you all. And you know, we hadn't really planned on doing a virtual tasting. You know, we started these during the pandemic, and of course they were a great idea. And now
I don't want to unmute.
it looks like there's a few people that are still talking, but hopefully we'll get this figured out. And we've just been asked to carry on the tradition. So here we are. We have 8 great wines in front of us from the 2021 vintage. And does everyone have their glasses filled? And we'll be tasting these all together in a few minutes. So please wait. Yeah, you can cheat a little bit if you want. We have eventually, once we get everybody admitted, we have I think we'll have up to 300 people at some point watching this video. We have people watching from over 30 different states, mostly from California, about 30% from California, followed by Florida and a few other states. So hi everyone, great to have everyone watching. And I just want to quickly introduce my host today. And first and foremost, you know, Brooks, if winemaking was so easy that you could just grow wine bottles like you're growing them behind you, wouldn't that be easy?
I can do this in my sleep, Tom.
Yeah, only we could make it do that. Brooks has been our director of winemaking for about 18 vintages. He's been in the industry for over 40 years, 42 years, been named twice winemaker of the year. I could go on and on, but Brooks, welcome to our virtual barrel tasting party.
Thank you and welcome everyone.
Yeah, and my next co-host is John Winkelhaus. John has been my colleague, helping me run the company. I think he's over a dozen or more years here at the winery. In his previous career, he ran one of the largest distribution companies for microcomputer products, was in charge of running a company called Ingram Micro, retired here in the Valley and has been part of the Visa Tuli team. And so just great to have you here, John.
Thanks, Tom. And actually, I was a farmer for a while too when I got first in the Napa Valley. So I grew one of my favorite grapes, Cabernet Sauvignon, at about 1,400 feet on Atlas Peak. And I think that's about the same elevation as Mount Veeder, which we'll talk later on today. So welcome, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, John. And then also like to introduce one of our winemakers tonight, Peter Velleno. Peter, thank you for joining us. And he's been a big part of our operations here, I think going on about 14 years. A UC Davis grad, and he has been so instrumental in helping us make these phenomenal wines. And before he joined us, he was with William Hill Winery, Hartford, I believe, and others. And boy, he's just risen through the ranks here pretty quickly. And thanks for joining us tonight, Peter. And then also many of you probably recognize our next 2 co-hosts. Of course, Marc Golick is our director of food and wine here at the winery. You'll see him holding court up in the tower, pouring his curated list of his favorite wines and food and wine pairings. And Marc, so good to see you. You were so much a part of our virtual barrel tasting parties, and didn't we have some guests just come in this last weekend and said how instrumental we were getting them through the pandemic? I know they were tickled to see you.
I think that we kept a lot of people company during the lockdown, that's for sure. And great to see everybody tonight. Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, thank you. And then lastly, Bob Cuozzo, I know most of you know him. He holds court, runs our cellar club, been a big part of our family now, it seems, for a couple decades. Bob, your hair was actually shorter a few months ago, and now it's starting to grow a little bit longer. But prior, Bob was an actor. He's from New York, a rock star, had his own band, and now he's our wine guru in the cellar. Good to see you, Bob.
Good to see everybody.
Good. Well, anyway, just a couple housekeeping items. There's a chat function. So if you have any questions, just use the chat and we'll do our best to answer those. Also, the best way to view the video is to use the speaker view. And then I think if you do that, you'll see our bright and smiling faces, or else if you do gallery, you'll see everybody. And so tonight you're going to hear from many of our growers. We got some great videos to share with you, some brand new videos that we've just made, and then we've set this up just like we would if we're doing a tasting here at the winery. Like if we're getting together with our winemaking team, we're putting these wines in front of us, we're talking about them, we're critiquing them, and so we're going to do it the same way. If you were here, kind of pulling the curtains back and you were watching us in a tasting, this is how we would be doing it. And then one other quick thing before we get to some of our hosts. As you know, we've been suffering through the last few years, given the pandemic, wildfires, and we lost virtually a whole vintage of Cabernet from the 2020 vintage. And then now we've been struggling with drought, and the 21 vintages you'll taste, and these are just tasting phenomenally. We just made a heck of a lot less of them. We really got hurt. Our crop yield was down about a third. We only allocate about 10% of our production to futures. So you can imagine our allocations came way down. And we had our barrel tasting party back, was it in March, I believe, a little bit later this year. And it was a phenomenal success. But what we did, because we know we wanted to do this virtual tasting, because so many of you were unable to travel to California in March, that we've held back some of these cases and allocated them just for you. So you have an opportunity in the next few days, or I think about a week at the most, that you can get these wines, and then all bets are off at that point. But and then we'll talk later, but of course you get great discounts and the special pricing and on and on. It's a phenomenal. And in fact, let's talk about this. What are some of the really good reasons to buy futures?
Well, the obvious one is the discounts are much greater than buying the wine when it's finally out. But the nice thing is you can spread out the payments. You pay half now and half later, and it can help you get into Gold or President's Club membership by not having to put out all that money right up front. So you can get into some of the higher levels that way by buying futures and paying half now and then half later. And when it does finally come out, you can say, I knew this when it was a baby. You get to try them. You can come in and taste them as they're developing, and you're the first ones to get them when they're released. And so it's nice and exclusive that you get it first. You can decide if you want to age it a bit or drink it while it just came out. And I think some of these are some of the best wines I've ever tasted here. So that's a great vintage.
Yeah, for a vintage that we made so little of, it was actually really great quality. I know, Bob, you see thousands of people come through the Cellar Club each year. About what percentage of your guests buy futures?
I'm going to guess around 20%, which is kind of low. I think more people should buy futures. We have so many members. They come very loyal, and they come year after year and drink the same wines. And I try to tell them, buy the futures, buy the futures. The first time is tough because you have to wait a year maybe, but when you get in that rotation year after year, you always have some great wines, and you pay a lot less for them that way. So especially with the price of gas and everything else today, I think it's a great buy.
Absolutely. Well, let's just get right into, before we start tasting the wines, I'd like to hear from the winemakers, and Brooks, maybe you can kick it off. Let's just talk specifically about this 2021 vintage, and what are your thoughts on this wine?
Well, as everyone knows, the last several years have been very dry, and we're in drought conditions. 2021 was severely impacted. Our rainfall was down over 50% in many cases. And usually what that means is when there's no rainfall, there's no cloud cover, we have more frost days. So we were protecting the vines from frost more frequently in 2021. The spring was cooler and colder, and the ground was quite dry. As Tom already indicated, the crop level was down an average of 20 to 30%, some even as much as 45% off. And so we have very limited production in 2021. The good news is what we made is absolutely fabulous. And as you can see in your glass, as we go through these wines today, I think you'll be very pleased. And we like to say we have very consistent vintage conditions out here, but less consistent than perhaps it was 20 years ago. And we never know what's coming our way. And so, it's always a bit of a surprise. And this is a particular vintage that you should definitely put away.
Pete, what are some of your thoughts on this vintage?
I think the wines ultimately, they're going to be phenomenal. They kind of remind me of the 2018s when they were young. It was a dry year, as Brooks said. When yields are down, the grapevines behave very differently, and you end up with very concentrated small berries. And in winemaking, as long as you're not concerned about the quantity you're getting, it gives you really fantastic wines, especially the reds, which we're tasting today, are going to be really dense, really inky in color, concentrated flavors, and we have nature to thank for that.
One of the things that I just talked about at the beginning is that we wanted to structure this tasting like we would be doing it here at the winery. We're making an analytical analyses of what we're tasting. And so, Peter, Brooks, what would you share with the folks that are watching? What do you look for in these young wines? What are some of the markers that might give you an indication that this is a vintage of greatness?
Well, it starts in the vineyard, like everything. We are observing the conditions in the vineyard, the growth of the vines in the vineyard beginning in May, going through bloom and what we call berry set when the clusters are forming. And this is the initial phase of what we can expect from the harvest. But July, August, and September, and even early October can have a big impact. For example, in 2021, we had some nice heat days that came up in September and October. We call it our Indian summer. And it will often push the maturity of the grapes to a greater level of richness and complexity. So young wines, once they're in the tank, Pete and I begin tasting immediately, and then get together at least daily, if not every other day, to taste out of the vineyard, out of the tank, and observe what's happening with the extraction. And Pete, you can elaborate on that a bit.
Yeah, there's tasting wines is obviously a major part of our job, and I want to say the best part of our job is getting to taste all these great wines we're making. There are different ways to taste wine. If we are in production, we're looking for flaws. If we're making blends, we're looking at what in a particular wine might contribute to a blend or where it needs help. If we're doing tasting notes, we're communicating to our customers exactly what to expect. Here, we're tasting futures. So we're trying to project what the wine is going to taste like down the road, and our customers should be tasting it thinking, is this a style that matches my palate? And what do I think it's going to taste like going out a year or 2 years or longer? And the foundation of the wine is there. So If there's a burst of red fruit, that's going to persist in the wine. If it's blackberry, you'll find that later. What will change is the structure will soften, the acidity might soften, but it's really important to note that the foundation, the core building blocks of the wine, it's already in there. And as the wine ages in barrels, it'll continue to evolve. The selection of barrels is incredibly important for the winemaking. And Brooks, maybe you want to talk about how do we decide on which barrels we're going to use?
Well, I'm always making you upset with the selection of barrels because we have too many, and I can't seem to make up my mind. But we make so many wines here, and I try to select appropriate barrels for each of our varieties and each of our wine styles. I'm going to be using something different on Zinfandels than Syrah or Cabernet Sauvignon, for example, or Merlot. And so the Coopers craft these barrels specifically with nuances and flavor profiles that I think are going to match our particular style of wine. And we actually have a short video to share with you that will explain a little bit how the barrels are made and what are the important aspects of barrel making.
Barrels, the magical world of barrels. The importance of barrels in winemaking can be broken down into two categories. The first category really is a practical one. We need a barrel to be able to have a place to put our wine. It's really a container, a watertight container. Back in the day, that's how they transported all their wine, was just rolled it from one place to another. And the second reason we use barrels in winemaking is really the change in flavor that's caused by the oak barrel. And so it's improving the wine and taste of it.
The first process starts in the forest, but it's really taking the time to choose the perfect tree, the height, the width, the color. And then once that happens, you take it to the mill, and then that moves into naturally air drying outside for a minimum of 2 years. So just letting the natural elements kind of dry the wood, take away any green or bitterness, soften the tannins over the years.
You could call the addition of oak, the use of oak, as a spice rack, an enhancement with spice. The first step is making the rosette. The rosette is where they take all the individual staves and they put them together with a single or maybe two hoops. And so you have what looks like a teepee, essentially. They put this over an open fire, typically, where they use the same oak trimmings that they're making the barrel out of. So the rosette is sitting on top of the fire. Once the staves become malleable, they will close the bottom of the barrel and pull all those staves together, turn it over and put a metal hoop on that. Now you've got the barrel shape, but you put the barrel back on the fire once again, and you might rotate it a few times during this toasting process. So all these factors come into play.
So the difference in American oak and French oak, I think that's the big question that a lot of people ask. In the United States, we primarily grow white oak, and the French oak is primarily European oak. So really, these are two different species of oak, and so that contributes to different flavor profiles that you can get out of each one.
The French oak is grown by the French government in managed forests. And so they're meticulously grown and kept. This started back in the era of Napoleon when he realized he was running out of oak for his navy. And so they instituted this mandatory planting of trees. It's really unique in the world. There's no other place like it. American oak, it is not farmed like the French oak. It's basically wild trees out in the forest in their natural habitat, natural environment. It has a much higher density, and so an American oak barrel is going to weigh about 25 pounds more than a French oak barrel.
Now, typically, American oak gives you flavors of vanilla, kind of sweeter tones on the palate can be a little bit more robust. Whereas a French oak typically will give you more aromas of spices and it will be a little bit more subtle. Both have their place in winemaking. Here at Sattui, we have a majority of French oak, but we do have some American oak as well.
When trees are cut down, they're evaluated for the tightness of their grain. This grain is referred to as an important aspect of the release of flavor into the wine. So the tighter the grain, the slower the release of all those compounds. The more open the grain, it's more rapid. So you use this information to determine what is preferable for each variety. So for example, Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, it's about 9 to 10 months in the barrel. So you're going to be using something that is a little quicker to release those flavors than what you might choose for Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Zinfandels, which have close to 20 months. So you have almost 2 years of aging with those, and that way we go tighter and tighter grain, knowing that that's going to be a slower release, but it's more appropriate for those wines.
On the winemaking side, we get to choose what forest it came from. We can choose the toast level, and this has a huge impact on wines that we make. When you have a barrel that has a light toasting versus medium, medium plus to heavy, you're getting many different flavors out of the barrel that go into the wine. A lighter barrel is very high in oak tannin, and so this adds body and adds texture. Whereas if you get to a heavier toast, that heat and that fire integrated farther into that stave during the toasting process, and it changed the chemistry of that wood to give you flavors of vanilla or spice or coffee bean. We ask the coopers to toast to certain levels that we feel would pair well with our wines.
So one barrel, it takes about 8 hours from start to finish. Right now we're making about 85 barrels a day. We can customize just about anything. For Sattui, we customize the different grain tightness within the French oak, toast level, toasted heads or not. Also, people choose different hoop placements, so things can be very customized to a particular client.
In terms of selecting new versus used, that is a stylistic question. Oak is very valuable, very costly, and so you want to be really judicious with your use of new barrels. And so, for example, our Merlots or lighter reds might get a third new French oak every year. And then Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, Malbec, we're usually shooting in the 60 to 80% new oak every year. So we are impacting the wine fairly aggressively with the wines that are going to be aged longer in the barrel.
So here we have a Cabernet Sauvignon. And so this was in oak for about 18 months. During that time, the oak barrel has really imparted some amazing flavors to it.
Of course, you have Cabernet Sauvignon, black cherry, cassis, some really beautiful black fruits.
Some coffee beans, and definitely in this one.
That toast from the oak, it just adds a different element, makes it very exciting.
Yeah, it's absolutely, absolutely beautiful.
If you look at the entire process and the years that it takes for a barrel to actually come to life, the barrel standing next to you could be older than you ever will be. So all the hands and all the people and the hard work that went into making that single barrel, I would definitely say there's various forms of art.
All right, hey, great video. And hopefully we all learned a little something about barrels, and I saw a chat come through that shared that we actually have those folks come out here during our crush party, which we're having this year as well. And a lot of fun to see these made in person. Well, look, we got to get going on this tasting. So, John, I think you're up. Let's start drinking some wine, or tasting, I should say. John, what's our first pick here? I think John is muted here. Hopefully he'll get this figured out, but we're going to start with our, here we go, John, we got you.
Sorry about that. I was fighting the instructions from our person that's in control. So anyway, this is one of my favorite wines. It's the Pilgrim Vineyard, located in the Lodi area. I won't talk too much about the flavors I get from it. I'm going to let Mark and Pete talk about it a little bit, but it is one of my favorite wines. It's for me just one of those Zinfandels that is just so food friendly. Comes from a vineyard that was settled back in 1998 by the Hirsch family. So it's owned by Joel and Martine Hirsch. And they moved around an awful lot and they finally decided to settle down on this vineyard. So the Pilgrim, if I recall correctly, the story about picking Pilgrim came from John Bunyan's work, The Pilgrim's Progress. So it's an interesting story, and so many of the vineyards that we're going to talk about today actually have great stories with them as well. The vines are 70 years old, at least certified or verified 70 years old, and many people believe they're somewhat older than that. So as I taste the wine, I hope you'll taste it with me. I'm getting initially a lot of blackberry, brambleberry sorts of flavors on it. And certainly some earthiness as well, but I want to just ask Mark, what components of this wine really stand out to you?
You know, out of our entirety of Zin lineup of now, which there are 13, and I'm blessed by that because it is my personal favorite varietal, but the Pilgrim every year to year stands out to me with the most concentration of fruit. This is really, you know, when you talk the language of Zinfandel, you've got your jam and you have your spice, and often it's a teeter-totter one way or the other. And I always look at this as leaning towards that jam side, although it doesn't come across at all as sweet or viscous. It's just that concentration of stewed fruits. But the spice component comes in more like a dark chocolate spice. It's a supple earthen spice instead of that, you know, who missed my Caesar with the pepper grinder effect.
Right on, Mark. And what's some of the food pairings you might suggest for the audience here? Because for me, this is a great food wine. So what would you pair it with?
It truly is. And any time that you have a wine that is so incredibly fruit driven, it makes it even easier to pair up foods. But to really complement what makes this wine what it is, this fruit concentration, bringing in some spice to highlight some of the backbone of the wine, but also bringing in some sweetness that really then does highlight the fruit bombness of this wine. And it's so funny you ask. I just happen to have some candied spiced bacon here, which really tends to be the world's perfect pairing with a Zinfandel as such. So if anybody wants to come join me in the reserved tower tasting room, this is something that will come with your tasting as well, and you can come find out for yourself and don't have to just believe me. But the other thing that immediately comes to my mind about this wine is barbecue. And I mean the real thing, you know, slow cooked, and having something with that sweet and spicy slather sauce that's going to mirror and just absolutely complement this wine perfectly.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. And you know, when people come in and they're looking for a Zinfandel, or maybe not even looking for a Zinfandel, what I always ask them, do you like to barbecue? And so how do you make it? I mean, and so if you have something that's a little more savory, I mean, Pilgrim is just perfect for that as well. Can I get over to Pete just for a moment? And can you tell the audience a little bit of how you handle this in the cellar?
Yeah, so the Pilgrim Vineyard Zinfandel, we tend to pick it while it's on the riper side, which is true for most Zinfandels. When that means that the sugars are going to be higher, you're going to have riper flavors. It really brings out those inherent fruit characteristics. I always find that the Pilgrim is a bit more on the red side, raspberry rather than only the deep dark blackberry that you might get in some of our other properties. Zinfandel is fairly thin skinned, so you have to be careful with it in the fermenter so that it doesn't all kind of fall apart and disintegrate. So that means that we're treating the wine very gently. We're doing longer, slower fermentations. That takes the stress off of the yeast, which might struggle when it's reaching a higher alcohol levels. As the wine ages in barrels, we actually treat the barrel selection a lot similar to what Marc was saying about sweetness. So we'll pick some sweeter profiled barrels, such as a little bit of American oak, do really well with the Pilgrim Zinfandel because the sweetness of the oak and the inherent spiciness of the wine, they go so well together. And for aging, we always keep it a little bit lower on the new oak percentage, about a third. Any more than that, and you mask the really nice fruit, which is definitely the focal point of a wine like this.
Perfect. Perfect. Brooks, this is your 16th year making this wine. Why is it so singular? What do you like about it?
Well, this is a very unique wine coming from a unique location. Lodi is, to most people's viewpoint, is the Central Valley, south of San Francisco. And it looks like we're transitioning here. And so it's not as cool as the coastal valleys, but it's not like what you might expect down in Madera or the northern Sacramento Valley. So it does have still some coastal influences going on there. These vines being 75 plus years old, they're very low yielding. And the thing that strikes me the most about this wine is the accessibility. It's totally a crowd-pleasing Zinfandel. Some people might think some Zinfandels are a little bit too aggressive, a little bit too tannic, or a little light in flavor and color. This always hits the middle stride. It's just always delicious. And it's one of our really most award-winning Zins in competitions.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So consistency, and Marc mentioned it a little earlier, consistency in this vintage after vintage. The first harvest ball in 2010 that I worked, we had the 2008 Pilgrim, and it was named Wine of the Year at the Winemakers Challenge. And just recently, the Monterey Wine Competition named it the best Zinfandel. So if you like Zinfandels, if you're not familiar with Zinfandels, if I could recommend a Zinfandel to purchase, this would be right on.
Yeah. Well, thank you, John. I think, we could almost bottle this wine right now. It tastes so good. It's delicious. Well, thank you, John. Well, look, let's transition now to the Napa Valley. And Marc Golick, this Quality Vineyard Zin, I think you used to play in this vineyard as a kid. This is your wine. Tell us about this wine.
I do have a tremendous sentimental attachment with the Qualia Vineyard here in St. Helena. Indeed, growing up as a kid, used to just go over my back fence with the guys and make our way down the rows of this old vine vineyard to go play in the creek. And then I watched my daughter do that some years later too. So, but it's not really the true reason of why I love this wine and this vineyard so much. It really is, it's everything about it. It's from the people, it's the family, to the care, to the love, to the small production, to the stress, to the elegance and the balance. And those are all pretty rare things to still be finding here in Napa Valley. So there's so many things I can say about this wine, but the sentimental attachment is only secondary. I always decide my favorites through blind tasting. And whenever I line up, and this is all the time and every year and through the months of the year, when I line up all these Zinfandels together, the Qualia always comes out as my top winner. And I think it just embodies two words that I mentioned a little earlier, but I think that they're rare words to use with Zinfandel, which is elegance and balance. We talked about this teeter-totter of jam and spice, and when you can find one that is so even keel like this, and just in such a small production, and you really feel the love in the wine without trying to sound corny in front of everybody.
Well, it's again, we love this wine here at the winery. And Brooks, I'd like you and perhaps Pete to talk a little bit about some of the characteristics of this wine. I know pepper is and spice is always something that we perhaps talk about with quality, but why don't you share with us your thoughts?
Well, I love the quality of Zinfandel, and the fact that it's right in our backyard is really special. These old vines, 75 years old plus, planted just after the repeal of Prohibition. And as was common in the day, it's not 100% Zinfandel. It's got a few other varieties. It has Carignan, Petit Syrah, Alicante Bouschet. I even found some white grapes in there, Golden Chasselas. This was typical at the time because people didn't want to rely solely on one variety. They wanted the power from Petit Syrah, they wanted the color from Alicante, and they wanted the jammy notes from the Zinfandel. It always has incredible color, concentration, and it's one of our first grapes that we harvest every year because it's mostly dry farmed. There's very little water involved, and so it comes on usually about the 4th week of August, 1st week of September, and we have to get it off immediately. It will start to shrivel and it'll start to go over the hill if we're not watching it very, very carefully. So the timing of harvest is really key here. And ever since I started with Sattui almost 20 years ago, this has always been one of my top zins.
Pete, maybe you could speak just to a little bit what makes this wine special for you. You know, we have 13 Zinfandels, and so it's hard sometimes. And you would think as professionals, we could pick out each one in a blind tasting, but it's tougher than you think.
It is tough. The Zinfandel program is one of the reasons I think Sattui winemaking is so special. I personally love Zinfandel, and what makes the quality special is just how well balanced the wine is. It shows you why Napa Valley is a special place to grow grapes, and that's not only for Cabernet. Zinfandel, it's not over the top jammy. It's not over the top spicy. It really is, a well-suited grape for the area. Being in St. Helena, it's almost like another estate vineyard for us because we drive past it every day. When it's time to harvest, as Brooke said, it's really a small window to harvest this wine at its peak because it dries out so quickly. Luckily, it only has a very short trip down the road to the winery. It's right there. I really like Zinfandel. It's the #1 wine for regular drinking in my household. I have a bottle of Zin, the Howell Mountain actually open right now from last night. I could eat just about anything with Zin, and I do. But Mark, what do you think would be something that would be really well suited for this particular wine?
I really love that. That's the comment that you just left for my interlude, because when I go so crazy on this wine up here in the reserve room, or actually wherever I am on the property, and I'm showing people this wine for the first time, and they just see this exuberance of passion that I have for it, and then they learn that I'm the wine and food pairing chef here, and the first thing out of their mouths is, well, what do you pair with this wine? And I tell everybody the very same thing, which is sarcastic but accurate, but that is just simply my porch. Because a wine that is so elegantly balanced like this, you don't have to think hard. It is pretty much welcoming and open arms to all kinds of foods. It is acidic and bright enough in its fruit nature that it won't run over things as light as tomato pasta dishes perhaps, but it's also robust enough in its nature to hold up to your peppered steaks and your barbecued items, your smoke and your spice. And so to me, it's my performer, it's my house red, it's how I abuse the majority of my fringe benefits here.
Look, let's kind of wrap this up, but 2 more questions. One, Brooks, I want to direct this towards you. Just quickly, please talk about the heritage clones, and that's so important to the quality of Zinfandels and these old vines. And then Bob, I want you to bring it home and just talk a little bit about the popularity of Qualia as far as folks visiting the cellar club.
Oh, that's a great point, particularly with Zinfandel, Tom. The concept of heritage clones goes back to the early plantings in California, and Zinfandel in particular was a big mystery for decades and decades. No one knew where it came from, how it arrived here, and it was even believed to be a native Vitis vinifera, in other words, the European grapevine, that somehow had magically appeared in North America. But over the decades, people have done more and more research, and the term heritage clone goes back to that concept that the vines arrived very early. No one really knew where they were, but they knew that there were certain clones available. And so back in the day, a vineyard grower would look over his fence at his neighbor's vines and say, well, how come your cluster is a little bigger than mine? Or how come you're picking earlier than me? Or how come your clusters have darker color than mine? And so each individual grower started getting a reputation for their specific and special grape that they're growing. And of course, there's other heritage clones and other varieties, but it usually is referring to Zinfandel in particular. So what they mean is that these are cuttings that were actually taken from some of the really old vines, 100-year-old plus 125-year-old vineyards here in Napa and other areas of California that were deemed to be really unique and special, and then replanted and propagated in other vineyards. And that's where the term comes from.
Well, I see every year that this is one of the most popular futures, partly because of how it tastes, but also it's very limited production. There's only about 6 acres, if I'm correct, of these ancient vines. And we're very fortunate that in 2020, it was one of the few Zinfandels that we had. It was the only Napa one that we had. Most of the others were from faraway places, Contra Costa, Russian River, Dry Creek. So the fact that they pick it a little bit early is great, that we got some in 2020. The 2021's fabulous. I love this cinnamon spice in it, but once again, it's very elegant. Steak, ribs, pizza goes with just about anything. And people just love this wine. It's this, Black Sears Vineyard, Ramazzotti, those are some of the more popular ones.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Bob. Well, all these Zins are just tasting terrific. Well, I'm excited to go on to the next one. This is our Schoolhouse Creek. And Brooks, if you would please be so kind to introduce this wine so we can keep this tasting going.
The Schoolhouse Creek is located up in Upper Dry Creek Valley in Sonoma. So this is northwest of the town of Healdsburg. It's towards the coast, but still in a fairly warm alluvial soil climate, well drained. It is 100% dry farmed. The vines were planted over 60 years ago, and it's on an upland bench. So the view from the vineyard itself, looking down at Dry Creek, is absolutely amazing. The name Schoolhouse comes from an old one-room schoolhouse that was located near below the vineyard, right along Schoolhouse Creek. And Schoolhouse Creek runs along one side of the vineyard. The vines are Grand Pear vines. They're old and crusty. They're covered with moss, and just absolutely wonderful fruit that we get out of there. So Zinfandel is the kind of creature that the good stuff only comes from really old, mature vine. So I'm going to have to use that on my grandson and granddaughter one of these days, I think.
Well, Brooks, speaking of views, this video that we're going to show next shows everyone how beautiful the view is from this vineyard up on the bench. It overlooks the Sonoma and Dry Creek valleys. And you're going to hear from Joe Ramazzotti. who has a great history with this vineyard. So I think Allie's going to tee this video up for us right now.
Schoolhouse Creek Vineyards was the old Peterson Ranch, and I lived next door to them when we first got here from Italy in '58. And the Peterson family, Carl and Alice, took me in, and as their son, and I helped them farm. I helped plant this vineyard back in '74, and then it was a natural for me to come back and farm it when the new owners bought it. This is all Zin, and then there's a little block along the road which is Petit Syrah, but this is old style Zin. The harvest, this is actually the old Mazzoni clone, Century clone, and because I remember this was all planted to rootstock, and we budded this vineyard. Well, it is a special piece. So this has never had any water except natural rainwater. There's a beautiful spring right up here above us that covers this whole hillside with water underneath. And these vines, look at them, they're still in great shape at this late in the year. And it's a very special spot. Well, the new owners didn't know anything about vineyards, so they trusted in me to handle it right for them. And I've had, which is so lucky. Besides Sattui, I sell it to 5 different little wineries, and it's been just well received from everybody and stuff. And it's just a gorgeous spot. So just a minimal fertilizer and pruning. And always dry farm vineyard, you need to cultivate it every year, so there's no competition from the grasses and weeds. Zinfandel seems to do so much better. There's a lot of Zin on wire and drip, but not this one. We're so lucky. Again, we have such a beautiful spring, and these vines, they're called head prune vines this way. They don't overcrop them. You can't overcrop them, and that's why they last for so long. And this taproot on these vines will go down almost 20 feet searching for water, and that's about where that spring is at. So that's why they look so beautiful at this stage of the year. And they've survived through 50 years so far without any man-made water, all only from natural rain. The heritage clone that was at least 100 years old, and it was. They still don't know exactly where it came from, but here in Dry Creek Valley, that was one of the main varieties planted, and most people wanted to always keep. It's a smaller clone Zinfandel, not a big bunch. And so they just love the flavor of it, and it ripens early, and it doesn't overcrop. That was another big advantage of it. After the gold rush in 1849, all the Italians, when they got here, never made any money with gold, but they saw the landscape and they loved it. But they brought their cuttings with them. At that time, it was mostly Primitivo. We still don't know, to tell you the truth, where exactly the Zinfandel variety came from. They think it's Croatian. But the old Italians then started planting these vineyards just like the old country, because the area looks like their country. They always kept it to 2-3 tons to the acre. And head prune vines, unless you leave so many spurs, you can't overcrop them. And by keeping it that way, it just prolonged itself. It could withstand the 100 years that it has on it. This vineyard has almost 50 years on it, and they still look like fresh, young vines. No other variety can withstand. I don't know of any other variety, 100-year-old Cabernet, Chardonnays, or anything. Just Zinfandel seems to have survived this whole deal. And some of them, there's some plantings in the Sierra foothills from 1849, still viable. They call this Schoolhouse Creek Vineyards because of the creek that flows right through here by that beautiful stand of firs that flows right into the into the dry creek. And it used to be a salmon run. The salmon used to come up that creek and spawn. We're right behind us. Of course, the sun sets right to the west. It is right behind us. This gets that full exposure all day long of that beautiful western exposure sun. So they get sun from the morning to the night. That's why they ripen so early, and they love this area. It was planted because of the way it was to keep the rows at a certain level. So as we drop down, there wouldn't be a complete drop off. They kind of terrace themselves. Again, the old Italians found out that Dry Creek was the perfect spot for their grapes. And they tried other varieties, Sauvignon Blanc, they tried Cabernet, they've tried everything, not at this site right here, but along Dry Creek. And they figured out after 100 years that Zinfandel seems to be, just loves it here. It does not overcrop, it ripens early, and it seems to grow very well in this environment. I think it's from the sun exposure and this soil that's here.
Hey, you're muted, Tom.
Thank you. It's a great video. And I just want to ask this one last question before we go on to the next wine. You know, Joe's talking a lot about dry farming and the quality of these vines. Can a vineyard like Schoolhouse Creek be a blueprint of how we navigate climate change and a warming climate and drought? And can we live with less water? I mean, these vines aren't even irrigated, and this wine is just amazing. It's delicious. So can this be a blueprint for the future?
Well, I think it absolutely can. We're going to have to go through some real structural changes. We've been planning vineyards based on water availability and other inputs, tight spacing. So if we're going to go back to dry farming, we've got to choose the appropriate rootstock. So Schoolhouse Creek is on the old St. George rootstock. It's very, very drought tolerant. It has that big taproot that Joe was referring to. But you also remember he has a spring above that vineyard. So it's not like they have zero water. They have some water, groundwater. There's no snow applied water near the surface. And I think when that happens, when you have a big root system, the vines are healthier, they have more vitality, they're going to last longer than if we are just dripping right on the surface, which is what we currently do with most of our vineyards.
Well, it's a delicious wine. My hats off to the winemaking team and to Joe Ramazzotti. I mean, his passion comes through on that video, and he's just like that in person. And what a great guy. And of course, he supplies us with the Ramazzotti Zinfandel grapes, which unfortunately we're sold out of already. But there's still some Schoolhouse, and it's really good. Well, look, let's get on. We got one more Zinfandel, and this is the granddaddy here. This is our Black Sears How Mountain Zin. So Bob, would you please introduce this wine for us?
So the Black Sears is up on Howell Mountain, just north of us here at the winery. And it is biodynamically farmed. That's one of the most frequently asked questions. What does that mean? Well, the good part, it's organically farmed. The second part of it, it's sort of esoteric, that everything is one, the air, the water, the earth, it all has an effect on one another. But it makes an astounding wine with black pepper, anise, blackberry. It's just got fabulous flavors, but it's the spice. Some people ask why it's not as spicy as it used to be. Not quite sure how to answer that one, but this one is a fabulous vintage 2021. And let me see if I can get my, there we go. Okay, it's magic. We can make it disappear.
Maybe we'll speak a little bit to spice and pepper, but let's hear from the people who actually farm this vineyard. And I believe we have a video to show you with Brooks is in the video, and I think Ashley, the daughter of Jerry Sears and Joyce Black. And it's always fun to see the beauty of Black Sears video. And I think Allie will be teeing this up here for us. And here we go.
Well, we are at one of the highest vineyards, if not the highest vineyards in the Napa Valley. We're at the top of Howell Mountain. We're currently at Black Sears Vineyard, about 2,800 feet above sea level.
My mom went to St. Helena High School and enjoyed life growing up here before it was wine country. When she met my dad, they met on a Sierra Club camping trip. He was the leader. before they were married, she knew that she wanted to come back to this place. She felt it was a very special place. So they bought property together here on Howell Mountain before they were married. And that was partly because she wanted peace and quiet, and partly because she wanted peace and quiet for her child. This Zinfandel parcel that was planted in 1975 by a couple from San Francisco. And when my parents purchased it in 1980, it was about 5 years old. The well went dry, no fencing, deer were eating everything, the rabbits were eating everything, and they called it the hard luck vineyard. Just wasn't turning out to be what that couple had hoped. So my parents actually purchased it thinking, you know, we don't like noise. We just would like to, you know, make sure that this little place stays quiet as well. And I guess we'll grow grapes. And yeah, I spent my childhood playing in the vineyard through the mustard season. It was very idyllic and beautiful, wonderful childhood. In 1984 was when Sattui made a Zinfandel that won a very prestigious award in Europe. And that was one of the first beginnings of our relationship through wine with this vineyard. A little bit about the vineyards. It was planted in 1975, and it was actually planted by our neighbor who is at the very end of the road, Bob March. And the clone is a Hain clone, which is a heritage vineyard Zinfandel in St. Helena.
The Hain Vineyard is a property down in St. Helena that was originally planted prior to the turn of the century, the late 1800s. And at the time, Napa Valley was known as much for prunes and walnuts as it was for grapes. But there were some people who really wanted to make some wonderful wines. And the Hain clone on the Hain property has unique characteristics in terms of its cluster size and what we call morphology. It tends to be very large. The berries are a little bit larger than you might find in some Zinfandels. It's very juicy, and it has this unique black pepper characteristic to the wine. It's head trained. The vines are spaced quite far apart, and no irrigation. The majority of the vineyard is dry farmed, which again adds to unique characteristics in the wine. Howell Mountain is quite a unique location, being well above the valley floor and mostly forested. There's huge fir trees, oak trees, madrones, and so you can see really quickly where the fertile soils are. And the optimum soil conditions for grapevines in Howell Mountain are a couple of the soil series we refer to as Aiken or Boomer, and what they have in common are a lot of volcanic origin. So they're often red colored. They have a lot of iron, and they all have a lot of nutrients. Over the last several decades, it's unfortunate, most of the old vine Zinfandel in Napa Valley has been removed and replanted to Cabernet Sauvignon. Cabernet Sauvignon is the highest and best return for most growers. And if you're growing Cabernet and you can sell it for $75 to $100 a bottle versus Zinfandel for $35 to $45, obviously you're much better off with Cabernet. Unfortunately, that means that these old heritage Zinfandels that are so wonderful and have so much to offer, many of them have been replaced. So this particular vineyard is super rare right now. It's a real treat to be working with a vineyard like Black Sears and having the opportunity to make just a fabulous wine from some older vines. This has always been a favorite of ours at V. Sattui. And so, you know, we're approaching, what is it, 40 years of harvest from this vineyard, and it's one of our favorite Zinfandels.
For us to be able to continue that stewardship, really the wine and the grapes allow for us to do that and allow for us to raise our family here. I think it's my hope that for both for us and for Napa, that we can use that privilege of farming and winemaking in order to preserve what we love about Napa Valley.
You know, a couple of things come to mind when I watch that. I wish all of you would have the opportunity to walk these vineyards like we do. You know, it's such an honor to be able to walk through those vines, or whether it's Schoolhouse Creek or Qualia or Black Sears. It's so much of those wines. It's that terroir that gives these wines their individual character. And I'm just looking at how many cases we have available of this wine on futures. 46. You know, that's going to go before the end of this show. And you know, we're so low on many of our Zinfandels right now, as I think we were talking earlier. You know, we missed most of the 20 vintage. We made maybe only a third of what we typically would make from the 20 vintage because of the wildfires. We were lucky to get Qualia and Amador and some of the others that were unaffected by the wildfires. And then with the limited allocations, you know, we're almost out of most of our 19 Zinfandels now. And so I think would be a good idea to perhaps get some of these 21 futures. And then before we go on to the next flight, because I know we have a lot more wines to taste, let's just finally now, what's the final word on pepper in this vineyard? I want to hear from the winemakers, because that's something we talk about every year. You know, more pepper, less pepper. What's the deal?
Well, I think that Pete, you can follow with your comments in just a moment, but you know, Bob said it's biodynamically farmed, which means it's organically farmed. And Zinfandel, those large clusters that you saw in the video, are somewhat susceptible to rot and botrytis. And back in the day when we were conventionally farming this vineyard, we had better protection against rot in the interior of the vine. And this particular clone, if it doesn't see a lot of sunlight, it doesn't fully mature and become deeply red. So you might have some more pink fruit in the interior of the vine that's more shaded. And so part of the biodynamic organic process is that those clusters need to be better exposed and need to be removed from the interior. It's my belief that the black pepper came a lot from those interior clusters back in the day before we transitioned to farming. So perhaps the black pepper is a little less today, but we have a better impact on the ground and the soil and the neighbors. And so that's just something we have to deal with. And still make the best of it. I always get a little bit of black pepper and spice every year, no matter what we're doing in the vineyard. And then Pete receiving these grapes, it's his favorite Zinfandel every year after year. He's always says, what am I going to do with this? And I say, Pete, just calm down. This is going to be so great. You won't believe it.
That's funny. I laughed at the video when Ashley was mentioning the original owners, thinking all the problems they were having in that vineyard. And I knew you were thinking the same thing as me, that I always used to complain about this wine. It just seemed like anything that would go wrong, minor things like the thermostat didn't work on a tank or something. But no matter what happened, the wine always turns out so well. And I think I've stopped complaining about it. That was probably 10 years ago. It's been a while. But I couldn't agree more on the pepperiness. It comes from those smaller berries or the pink berries. It's one thing about Zinfandel. I think it's acceptable in Zinfandel, or even preferable in Zinfandel, to have these different sized berries. And whereas in almost every other variety, that's not necessarily a positive thing. So in Zinfandel, the peppery nature from those pink berries, it's almost like it's a flaw. So as vineyard management improves and you get more consistency in the vineyard, you're going to see less of certain characteristics. And that's just a side effect of learning more. And as you said, taking better care of the land produces different types of grapes. But Zinfandel is always going to have this variety of different flavors, this mix of really ripe, juicy flavors and spicier, peppery flavors. And that's part of why Zinfandel is so great. You get this combination of sweetness and pepperiness, and that's always going to be there.
Well, thank you for that. Well, John, I know I talked a little bit about already why people should buy this wine, but I know this is a favorite of yours as well. And any last thoughts before we move on to the Bordeaux flight?
I mean, there's every one of the Zinfandels we've talked about already. I mean, if you were to stack rank them, they'd all be even at number one as far as in my opinion, the best Zinfandels that we make. Congratulations to the production team. But this one, I mean, is so different from each and every other one. It's wonderful. And I just look at the most recent accounting of our Zinfandels and Black Sears. If you want it, if you like it, it's time. Make your purchase as soon as you can, because there's not that much left of it. And as Tom reminded us all earlier, there's not much 2020 wine coming in. So the 2021 is the time to buy. And the 2019 was kind of a short vintage as well. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, again, that we made it. We got through 4 wines. We got a lot of work ahead of us, but thank you for that. Well, look, I'm excited now to get to the Bordeaux. The first wine we have on tap is our Victorios. This comes from our own estate vineyard. Brooks, why don't you please introduce this wine for us?
Yeah, I love this vineyard for many respects. The fact that it's right in our backyard, and I can go out there 4 or 5 times a day if I want to, is key to that. It's near and dear to our heart. We've replanted parts of the vineyards over the years. The Victorios cab is always remarkable. The alluvial soils that we have here, very limited water availability, so the yields are always a little stingy. But the wines tend to be, fairly robust, great tannins, great plush flavors in the mid palate, and so Victorios is really one of my favorite cabs.
Well, this was our very first vineyard that we converted to organic farming. Sattui purchased this vineyard back, this is going back to 1985, and so we converted to organic a number of years ago. How do you think that's impacted the quality of this wine?
Well, when I'm out in the vineyard, I see more insects, especially beneficial insects, ones that are preying on some insects that might be detrimental. I think that certainly the vines are growing better. They seem the density of colors in the leaves and the maturity of the fruit is better. Our dedication to moving to organic farming benefits not only the vines and the soil, but also our neighbors and ourselves, because we live right here in the vineyard. And so this is something we've made a commitment to. We're learning every year, because every year is different. And we may find that something that we used last year is not perhaps working quite as well as the current year. We have to live with learning how to add fish emulsion to grapevines. And if you can just imagine how that's supposed to work, because we're not using artificial or fertilizers derived from fossil fuels, for example. And we're using more compost. All of our weed control is mechanical, either with mechanical weeders or by hand. And so it definitely requires additional labor and inputs. Tom, you asked me the other day, is the only difference between organic and conventional farming 7 days? And there's something to be said for that. With organic, we have to go through about every 7 days and walk through the vineyard and treat any issues that we're having. The sprays that we're using are very soft and kind to the environment. That means they don't last very long. So we're having to go into the vineyard more frequently, but in the overall scheme of things, we feel that this is really valuable for our dedication to doing the right thing for the planet and the right thing for our customers and our neighbors.
Yeah, and it's making a darn good wine too. Well, look, we just completed, I think no one has seen this video yet. We just completed it just recently, and we're excited to share this video with you at Victorios Vineyard.
When Dario revived his family's winery here in the Napa Valley, and this is about 1976, the original purchase he made was for about 2.5 acres. It was an old walnut grove, and for about $15 a square foot, he built our original winery in deli and marketplace. And at that time, we didn't have any vineyards. We purchased all our fruit, and when I started the winery in the harvest of 1980, the vineyard just to the south of us was owned by a doctor from Marin County, but it was farmed by an old timer here in the valley. His name was Charlie Volpe. And I remember meeting him about 1980, and he'd come into the tasting room, of course, all full of dust. He'd been on the tractor. He was always complaining that the trash from the picnic grounds was going into his vineyard. I said, well, Charlie, I'll do the best we can, but how about a glass of wine? And so we became good friends, and eventually in 1985 we purchased, which is now Victorios Vineyard. And oh boy, what a great purchase. And and at the time, we were a little bit nervous about the price. We paid I think $800,000-900,000 for the 34 acres. That's about what you buy an acre of vineyards for today. What a great purchase, and the rest is kind of history. And so those early years, the early 80s, there was some old vine Zinfandel. We made wine from that. And then our very first Sauvignon Blanc came from right here. And so now Victorios Vineyard is mostly Cabernet Sauvignon, but with a few other varieties. And we're very proud of that. So as you're driving up Highway 29, Victorios Vineyard is the first thing you see. We have close to about 1/3 of a mile of frontage right here on 29 for Victorios Vineyard, separated by a long driveway of olive trees. It's just a great position to have an estate vineyard when you have an event at the winery, or you're attending our harvest ball, or one of our many events. Our Victorios Vineyard lawn is actually right smack dab in the middle of the vineyard. It's just a sweet, sweet spot, and we're so very proud of the wines.
What makes this area special, it really was the origin of winemaking in Napa Valley. Most of the initial wineries and wine growing occurred here in the 1850s, 1860s, 70s. The soils here are really unique. In fact, one of the most unique spots in the entire world. There's over 21 soil types represented here. Over millennia, the oceans have entered the land, they've receded, the land's been uplifted. And as an example of that, I've got a couple of rocks that I picked up in this very vineyard. This one is one of my favorites. It doesn't look like much, but it's my belief that this comes from the age of the dinosaurs. It's over 60 million years old. And it just gives you an idea of the history, the geologic history of this area. This is chert, green chert, and it comes from marine organisms that filtered down to the bottom of the ocean. They were compressed over eons with soil and layers of dirt, and then uplifted because of this tectonic activity. And then of course there's obsidian. Our area is very rich in obsidian from what's referred to as the Sonoma volcanics about 5 million years ago. And it's all derived from alluvial soils that have come down the mountain behind us, the Mayacamas Range on the west and the Vaca Range on the east. So our farming practices have always followed the sustainable rules. We always try to use the least impactful chemicals, whether it's herbicides, fungicides, all of the typical farming materials that all growers use. So we made a commitment in 2009 to start farming organically. And we're certified by CCOF. It's a 3-year process to get certified, so you have to show what materials you've used for 3 consecutive years. So that was in 2012. So for the last 10 years, we've been farming organically here. We feel very proud of that achievement because organic farming does cost more, and we're committed to making that as a statement to our community, to protect the health of our employees, protect the health of our neighbors. We're willing to spend that extra money, but why do it? Does it make greater quality grapes? We believe that it does. It gives us a better understanding of soil and rejuvenate the biosphere here in our vineyard. We can see more birds, more insects, more lizards, more life across the board.
We've been producing Victorios Vineyard Cab for decades now, and it's certainly been part of our portfolio as one of our top cabs. Once we had really started farming Victorios organically, the wine to me just took on a whole nother level of complexity and flavors.
Well, I think there's a clear line between wine quality and farming operations. I think with organic farming, the health of the soil, the health of the vine is increased. The main thing is become more plush and velvety and round. These grapes often made a fairly robust, really firm wine. And that is just polished, it's smoothed out, and it's much more drinkable, much more enjoyable. The grapes evolve, and I think that's because of our organic farming. I think they're benefiting more.
And just smelling this wine, it's just jumping out of the glass, that classic, savoriness to it. How would you describe this wine?
Well, it always has, of course, black fruit. I get black currant, black licorice. There's a little bit of mint, of course, olive, classical Cabernet aromas. But what makes this distinct for me is the complexity of all these things coming together in the glass, and it just effuses out of the glass. And of course, during the winemaking, we're using French oak barrels, and they play a role as well.
I love this texture of this wine on the palate with today's Victorios Cab. The tannins are there, but they're really integrated. It's just almost like a fine grain.
Victorios Vineyard is primarily a Cabernet Sauvignon vineyard, but Cabernet lends itself to all kinds of wonderful, beautiful blends by putting in small amounts of other varieties.
Yeah, we really let Cabernet shine through. That's the challenge too, Brooks, with making a vineyard designated cab, where if you're making, let's say, a Napa Valley cab, you can blend from many, many different vineyards. When you put a vineyard name, 95% of the fruit has to come from that vineyard. So it really does speak of a place.
With single vineyard wines, the vineyard has to shine. Otherwise, you're wasting your time. So it has to have a standalone character and quality to it. So it makes it a more challenge, there's no question.
It's certainly one that we're really, really proud of. When you put Victorio's name on something, we have to honor him, and I think we do a really good job of it. This is really the origin or the provenance of Napa Valley farming happened right here in St. Helena. And for us to be making a wine, from this dirt that was really pioneered here. I feel very proud of that. And it's just so reflective of the magic here in the Napa Valley that we're able to craft wines made from such a spectacular spot.
Well, great video, Brooks. Thank you so much for your contribution to that. And boy, this is a special wine. I'm just wondering, Mark, what do we pair with this wine? And you got any suggestions?
You know, that out of all of our Cabernets, and whenever you do a tasting up here in the tower, I always have it listed at the very top, because we always tell people our cabs at the top of the list will be your more approachable. They're going to be full body, but they're going to be gentle and fruit driven. And then we'll work our way down to the more tannic and wooden and spice styles. And Victorio reigns at the top every year because of all the things I just said. It is so rich. It's that classic Napa Valley, core of the valley, dark cherry, cassis, all the things that Brooks described, but with a gentleness that finishes. And that's without having to be aged. And that's the thing to me that's always so impressive about this certain Cabernet that we make, is that it's like that when it's a new kid. You don't have to wait all those years in the cellar. However, for those of you who have had that experience and have had an older vintage of our Victorios Cabernet, you certainly know the payoff is huge and comes rapidly. So words like crushed velvet and silky don't even do this wine justice when it sees some years of aging.
Well, and that's, I just saw, I think Joshua Teeters just put something on a chat. He had some of these wines back from the eons ago, and they were totally different. These wines today are so much more polished. And just lastly, before we go on to the next cab, just Mark, Bob, Wink, what do you want to, anything add to what we've been tasting and what has made this vineyard so special for us?
Well, for me, Tom, it's I consider this to be one of the most eloquent cabs that we make. It's a Cabernet, but it's a little softer on the mouth. And boy, you don't need any food to enjoy this wine. It's just a great wine, soft, smooth, approachable, fabulous.
It's a lot of the feedback we get in the tasting room, how soft and approachable it is right now.
Yeah.
Even in its futures form like this, and from the people that I've given some barrel samples to, they all ask, how much Merlot is in here? And it's actually quite the opposite. We need to put a little Petit Verdot just to give it a little bit stiffer backbone, because our cab fruit is so gentle from the organic vineyard out here.
Yeah. Tom said it a little earlier. We could bottle this right now. It's a beautiful, beautiful wine.
Thank you. Well, look, we got to keep this thing moving. Well, the next wine, and I'd like to have Mark introduce this, is something that's been a part of our portfolio here at Sattui since 1976. What are we drinking here, Mark?
Well, this is our flagship cab property, and it's a whole lot of special things in one glass, or in the bottle, as I should say. And number one, we always get a lot of attention every year. The wine nerds love this wine. We're always highly rated. But even back in 1995, this vineyard wine of ours was rated #1 Cabernet Sauvignon, and that's a tough nut to crack in this neck of the woods. But it embodies everything to me that I think when I think Rutherford Cabernet. And we always say the word dusty, and that it just sounds like such a snooty way of saying earthy, but it's so different. It really doesn't give you the idea until you experience it, just how eloquent these wines are. And that dusty feature to me, people ask me all the time, well, what does that mean? What does the Rutherford dust mean? How do you describe those flavors? And it's really more of an experience to me than it is a flavor. And I've tried my entire life to really come up with a great description. And the best thing that I've been able to come up with is just simply, if you've ever wandered into the corner of an old library and no one's been there for some time, and you pick up one of those old dusty leathery books off the shelf, and all of a sudden everything around you becomes just rich and full and elegant in feel. And that's the Rutherford dust. And that is always going to be the finish of our Preston. It just sings, it lasts on the palate. Even when the wines are young, they're not overtly tannic, although they're full in body, and just sings that dark cherry Rutherford fruit.
Yeah, it's an amazing wine. And then what are some of your favorite food pairings with this, Mark?
Because it is rich, but it's soft and it's elegant. And to use a good meat analogy, when I look at our different Cabernet Sauvignons, and we're going to be coming up next into this particular one, I'm going to use an example of Mount Veeder. But I look at Preston as our petite filet mignon, where I look at Mount Veeder as our double cut bone-in tomahawk chop. This is something that is so, both great cuts, but very different feel. So filet mignon having this absolute fine grain, richness, softness, elegant, where then you have this rusticality and this meatiness and fat ripple coming in out of your ribeye. So to me, that's where I go. I go for these very gentle, rich, fatty cuts of meats. And then look for things also that can bring in umami. So without getting too geeky on everybody, umami of those earthy like tones. And the Rutherford dust is embodying the silkiest part of earthy tones. So something like a porcini risotto comes to my mind, where you have this richness and earth coming through that really will carry those pieces of the wine to the end.
Yeah. Well, look, I'd like to bring Brooks. I shouldn't keep drinking the wines here. I'd like to bring Brooks and Pete into the discussion here. A little bit about this signature style that's a part of Preston. And, I often just say this wine is delicious. I mean, it's a simple descriptor, but it has this signature style. How would you describe that?
Well, I think in one word, I would say intensity. It's just so rich, you could almost take it and spread it on a piece of toast. At the same time, it's delicate. Mark talked about the Rutherford dust. I often think of cedar, touch of cinnamon, spice, and some other cocoa powder, things that I get from this wine. The really nuances that I think tie back to the soil. But it's black fruit, it's dense. This has been a bit of a conundrum for me personally, because I was always trying to tie the soil to the vine and to the wine. And it is fairly dense alluvial soil. It's a little finer than other areas in the valley. It has a higher clay content, higher water holding content. The vines are big and robust, and they just pump out year after year after year the most amazing fruit. It's so delicious.
Well, I hope we have time. We have just a little short video that we'd like to show of the video of Preston. So let's take a look at that.
So my dad bought the property in 1969, and we moved up. Well, we started coming up in 71, and when we bought the place, it was all walnut trees. So it was a walnut orchard. It was one of the last few vineyards out on the valley floor where it had not been converted to a vineyard. So this was one of the last ones out there. My dad had been looking for it. For something where he could go to. He was originally a Kansas farm boy, got caught in the Depression, whole family packed up, moved out to Los Angeles and to California, and he got a job making airplanes. But he'd always kind of had this idea in the back of his mind that maybe it was from flying and going to different places and things of that nature, but he really wanted to have a vineyard, and he liked Cabernet.
For Preston Vineyard, it's really the strict viticultural protocols. We have very strict fruit thinning protocols. Our clones here are clone 7, clone 47, and clone 191. And although the vines are capable of producing 2 clusters per shoot, we take it one step above and drop it to 1 cluster per shoot. It hurts yields, but here at Preston, it's all about quality, not quantity. That's really what delivers the best product. Rutherford Dust, when you're enjoying a great glass of Rutherford Cabernet, you can taste those earthy components in the wine. It's what makes the wine in Rutherford phenomenal. But you're drinking that Rutherford Dust, and that's really what it's all about. It really also comes with the balance of viticultural techniques. You want to have the right rootstock that is appropriate for the soil. Here we have bale loam. The climate and the soil is really what makes the fine wine. It gets the earthy character from the soil, which influences the quality, the character, and the weather influences the quality. We really have the hot days that ripen the fruit and the cool nights that give the acids that are needed.
I remember Dario and my dad, from the very early years, talking with one another and things of that nature. I do love the fact that we have a vineyard here in the Napa Valley, but not just in the Napa Valley, but in the Rutherford Dust Society area. And so there's also kind of a feeling that you need to make sure that you do it right and that you keep doing it right and you don't mess it up.
Well, this has been, as I said, such a great wine for so many years. I think we just had this wine in one of our tastings the other day. Brooks and Pete and Jason was there, and I think we were going through the 2019s, and this wine just shined so well. And again, just to remind everyone, we lost the 2020 vintage because of the fires. We're just our inventories of this are going to be really short. Great opportunity for people to get some of this wine. Maybe just to end this tasting up, any other final thoughts from the panel here on this wine?
Tom, I'd like to just reiterate what you just said. Our tasting last week, we tasted all of the reds bottled from the 2019 vintage. And the Preston was the absolute standout, remarkable wine. And it's just a testament, I think, to the quality. 2021 is going to be every bit as good.
Yeah. Any other thoughts out there before we move on to our mountain fruit?
Yeah, just real quick, Tom. I mean, the difference between the Victorios and the Preston, it's noticeable. And boy, if you want something a little softer and more approachable, it's the Victorio. But the Preston is also approachable, but a very different flavor. And they're great wines and stand alone. It just depends on what you're eating. And Tom Brooks have a mention, and so is Marc. Filet mignon, tomahawk. That's what you want to do.
Well, Pete, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, it's a privilege to work with a vineyard. The history goes back so far between V. Sattui and the Preston family. And I've been working with V. Sattui for 14 years, and the grapes have been going to the winery for so much longer than that. It was made very clear to me when I started to, if anything, don't screw up the Preston. And I hope we always do a good job with it. I'm really happy with the 2021. I think the fruit really, really pops out of it. And it's amazing consistency year to year, what we can do with Preston Vineyard. Is such a well-balanced wine. It's never a miss. Wine is just, it's always a winner in my book.
Hey, thanks, Pete. Well, Wink, let's bring on some mountain fruit here. What do you got up for us next?
Well, we have the Mount Veeder Cab, and earlier I disclosed that I actually grew some Cabernet in a previous life up at about 1,400 feet. So I'm going to ask I'm gonna ask Brooks and Pete to talk about the appellation and what's the difference between Valley Floor and Mountainside Cabernet. Brooks, you want to take this first?
Sure. Well, they both play a huge role in this particular wine. Our Mount Veeder Cabernet comes from our Hibbard Ranch. It's the southernmost part of Mount Veeder, the southernmost part of the Mayacamas Mountains. And as a result, it clearly has a cool climate characteristic. I was pouring wines for some of our coopers yesterday who supply us barrels, and the general manager of the organization was here, and he's from Bordeaux. He cut his teeth on Bordeaux reds from the West Bank, Saint Estèphe, Margaux, all the famous chateaus, and I saw his eyes light up when he swirled this and smelled it and tasted it. It's really very, very unique in Napa. It's definitely more of a Bordeaux-like style, classic. I think it's really age-worthy, has a little higher acidity, soft tannins, really deep color, and that's the climate. Hillside plays a significant role as well, and I'll give Pete a chance to talk about Hillside versus Valley Floor.
Sure. So down on the valley floor, the soils are deeper, the soil is more fertile, and the vines love it there. They put their roots down, they are vigorous. And that's what you have with Preston Vineyard, which we just tasted, where the vines are very healthy, and you have to do a lot of work in the vineyard to limit the amount of crop so you don't have too much. You want a smaller crop so your grapes stay concentrated. But no matter what you do, valley floor fruit is always going to have this luscious fruit character. It's going to be well balanced. It's very different than the mountain fruit, in particular Mount Veeder. At higher elevations, you don't thin the crop at all. It naturally happens out there in the vineyard. If anything, in most years, we don't get nearly as much as we wanted. While there's less fruit, the fruit is such great quality. The smaller the berries, the bigger the flavors, the bigger the color, and in particular, the bigger the tannin. So these wines that are made from mountain vineyards tend to be robust and rich and age-worthy, and are just really large, distinctive wines that are really a lot of fun and super concentrated flavors, and really a large distinction between the valley floor fruit and our mountaintop fruit. Our Mount Veeder vineyard, as Brooks mentioned, tends to have a lot of the classic Cabernet flavors that a lot of people in the modern style in Napa Valley have gotten away from. Everything is ultra ripe and rather generic tasting, and our Mount Veeder is always distinctive. You get these bit of vegetal flavors, olive flavors, what we consider greener flavors, which are classic to the variety, like Bordeaux.
Yep.
Yeah, right on, Pete. It's if you go through the three Cabernets that we've tasted today, there's uniqueness in every one of them, and that's the beauty of the wines we produce, because we really are trying to produce wines that reflect the dirt they're grown in, and that's what is so fun to talk about to people who want to buy our wine as well. So I'm going to ask Mark to make a little comment on what he might want to pair with these wines.
Well, I touched on it earlier, to where I think that this, out of all of our Cabernets, has the loudest voice, the biggest character. It's up in your face. It's dark, it's inky, it's got that racy red ripe berry fruits, but mirrored with some spice and some minerality that comes from that terroir. And for me, it really is. It's just such a standalone. That rustic cut of meat is just what comes to my mind. I want that double cut bone and ribeye. I want my Mount Veeder, and those are my two happy places at the same time. But anything that you guys can think of, your favorite recipes that are rich in proteins, salts, fats, That's the kind of foods that are going to mirror and pair best with these super robust rustic mountain Cabernets.
Hey, Bob, I know this is always one of the favorite wines of our fans coming into the Cellar Club. What kind of feedback do you get from them about this wine?
Oh, they just love it. It's very popular. I'm surprised it hasn't sold out yet. I can't imagine there's much left, but it smells great. I get like a touch of lavender almost on the nose, but it just tastes fabulous. It's also got the most alcohol. No. But it's just doing very well for us. I think it's like Mark said, great with a nice juicy ribeye.
Brooks, you had such great comments, and I know we could geek out about this stuff for hours, but before we came on the air tonight, we were just talking about the article that's in the paper today by Dan Berger, who's been writing about wine for about 50 years. He was formerly the wine editor at LA Times and now here in Northern California. And just talking about how styles of Cabernet have changed. And I think I know he would love this Mount Veeder wine because it's authentic. It's not manipulated. It's not just big chocolate barrels but it's really the flavor of the soil. And you made a comment about, or maybe Pete, you're talking about the yields. I've walked the vineyard before harvest and it looked like the vineyard had already been picked. And Brooks is saying, no, it's just carrying a really light crop. And so, yeah, we're lucky to get sometimes 2 tons, 2.5, 3 tons an acre, where down in the valley floor, Preston is 4.5 tons or more. So you can really see, as Pete was talking about, the fertility of the soil in the valley floor versus what you get in the mountain. And I think those, that terroir really speaks to what it produces in this wine. Well, it's a great cab, and Bob, you're right that there isn't much of this left. The only reason we even have some available on features right now is because we've held back a fair chunk for this virtual wine tasting. And then once it's gone, and again, these are, we've lost 2 vintages over the years with the wildfires. And so we're really limited on these wines. Well, look, we have one last wine, and Pete, I'd like for you to bring this home and introduce. So this is not a Cabernet, but it's in the Bordeaux family. Please tell us about this.
That's right. This is our 2021 Malbec. It's really a fun variety. The wine is always vibrant and fresh and very fruit forward. So in Bordeaux, there's the 5 varieties. There's the ones everybody knows, Cabernet and Merlot. We also have Cabernet Franc and Petit Verdot, and now the 5th is Malbec, which we have here. It is definitely the outlier when it comes to these 5 varieties. The grapes don't look anything like the other Bordeaux grapes. They're much larger. They're much juicier. They have more of a floral nature to them. And it's really a lot of fun to make a single vineyard wine out of this. It's used in blends. It's used as a single vineyard. And it's become very popular recently. A lot of it is grown in South America, but having come from Bordeaux, it's a natural fit here in Napa Valley where all those grapes grow really well. And it's fun to use it as a blend and introduce it to people. It's also easier to say than the other Bordeaux varieties, and maybe that has something to do with why people tend to order it a bit more. But it's a lot of fun to make and a lot of fun to drink, and it always turns out well. It's one of those varieties that winemakers love because it's kind of hard to screw it up.
For me, Pete, and maybe you can speak to this. Certainly we have Malbecs from South America, Argentina, but personally, I love this Malbec a lot more than I do from the ones that we get from South America. Why is this so different, even though it's the same variety?
I think we grow it in a way that's going to maximize the quality as everything we grow. So we're going to farm it differently. Left to its own, Malbec is going to produce a massive crop, 7, 8, 9 tons per acre. And I'm not going to say that's what they're doing in South America, but when you want to make high quality luxury wine, you cannot carry that level of crop out in the field. You have to cut the vines back. You have to trim off the clusters and make sure that the clusters are not shaded, that they're exposed to the sun. So there's a lot of input you have to do in the vineyard, and here in the Napa Valley, we can afford to do that.
Well, hey, Mark, this is again a little bit different. What would you share or pair with this particular wine?
When you get into wines, and when I first looked at this lineup, I said, oh, wow, Malbec's last. I really love that, because really the tannins are much more riper in our Malbec than even in our most robust Cabernets, at least when they're younger. And when you go to the effect of being able to mellow tannins, you want to be able to use those proteins, salts, and fats. So any dish that you can think of, whether it's just sitting out having some nice dry aged cheese, or with that really dry aged piece of red meat, you're going to be in good hands.
Well, and we were just showing just that drone footage. This is a state for us. So this is fruit that we grow. And I'm very proud of that. And so not only are we making this as a standalone variety, but it's also a big part of our blends and finds its way into great wines like Paradiso and such. So, well, fantastic wine. And just lastly, Bob, I know this is a very popular wine in the Cellar Club. I know often you are thieving this wine a lot. We're always seems to be out of Malbec. Is that the case now? And why do folks enjoy this?
Yeah, it's one of my favorites. I call it the Marlboro Man because it's a little rugged with hints of leather and tobacco, and great with meats. Obviously in Argentina they have a lot of meat, but this is a fabulous wine. Great fruit. It smells fabulous. Although people aren't that familiar with it, I'm trying to turn them on to it. So when they ask me if they can have some Malbec, I say, oh, try this out of the barrel, and they get hooked on it. And so it's a good seller for us.
Well, thank you. Well, it looks like we made it. We made all 8 wines. If you're tasting these 2-ounce bottles by yourself, you've just drank a whole lot of wine. Even sharing it has been a fair amount of wine. Just a couple of housekeeping items. As I said, these wines are very limited. If you hopefully would like to order some, you can send your orders to visattui.com. You can contact your Visattui sales rep. It's easy to call us. We have the enclosed order form. Please keep in mind that, as we said earlier, you're only paying a 50% deposit, and so you get locked into these lower selling prices. Of course, please make sure you're taking advantage of the volume discounts. Basically, the more you buy, the more you save. And please know, the only reason we give such great savings on these wines is just as a benefit. Now, you are all members watching this, and you are so important to our winery and to us, and you are all great friends. And it's just another way for us to say thank you for being great fans of our winery. And if you're smart enough, you buy these as futures by the case, and you get locked into some great selling prices. And then someone asked, should you order right away? So what we've done is that we're gonna, the ordering window is 1 week. Hopefully some of these wines, I'm not sure they're gonna be around in a week, but the ordering deadline is 7/22. And thank you, Ali, for sharing that on the screen to receive the special participant discounting. So before we wrap up, and any last thoughts here from the panel, recommendations, anything else you'd like to add?
I want to ask all of you Gold and President and Hall of Famers, if you haven't done your Gold Room yet this year, please call me and let's schedule something so we can get you in here.
Well, if I could just add one thing, every year we're faced with the question, how great is this year going to be? And I think we answered that question today. 2021 is a great year, and you should lay some of these down in your cellar. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. We're just, you know, again, thank you for everyone for participating. Thank you for the great panel today. Boy, thanks to David Behar, our vineyard manager, and to Brooks and Pete and Jason, who couldn't join us today, and for the whole cellar crew. Thanks for the great wines that you're making. Thanks to Allie for her great production as always, you know, from the collateral, the printing of the labels, and all the work behind the scenes. Allie, oh my God, thank you for the great job that you do. And for Russell Perry, the videos, especially our newest one, two newest ones, the barrel making video and Victorios Vineyard, I thought were just excellent. And lastly, to Luke, who hand bottled 1,300 bottles to get these to you, so you can enjoy these tastings. And I think they just tasted wonderful. Thank you, everyone, and hope to see you soon here at the winery. We have Festa Italiana coming up at the end of July. We have Harvest Ball in September, Crush Party. All of our events are back on. Get your tickets before they sell out. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Cheers, everybody.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Salute.